I think, as you just mentioned, one of the core problems is that the incentives of politicians are distorted. They don't really have an incentive to do what's good for the whole population. They have an incentive to do what's good for the companies. They pay the money, they sponsor the parties. And this is huge in the US, but it's true even here in some extent. And I wonder what can be done, to change this. Because to me, until, we all recognize that capitalism is not perfect. There are market failures. When there are market failures, global warming, the global financial crisis, the politicians, the government has to step in. But if the government doesn't have an incentive to do that, nothing is going to change. The global financial crisis is a result of the regulation. The regulation happened because the bankers went to the politicians and said, look, just to regulate the market. They wanted to make money, obviously. The politicians get the money from the banks and they let it happen. But, until this system changes, I don't see how the Western society is going to change.
Okay. Well, let me give you first a little bit of an optimistic note, and then some views about what I think ought to be done, but whether it will, I'm not sure. The optimistic note is that the United States did pass a financial regulatory reform, which said it was what I describe as smelly Swiss cheese. It had a lot of good principles, but an awful lot of holes. And the process was at the end, it was a very smelly product. But at least it incorporated a lot of good principles. And what it showed is that 350 million Americans have almost as much voice as 5 banks. So we have now here a balance of power. And the banks were very helpful, actually. A couple of the banks were so outrageous in their behavior that it was impossible for Congress to ignore them. And there was a political contest. One of the candidates, the chairman of one of the committees that was responsible, was up for re-election, and the electorate made it very clear how they felt, and she had to respond. She did respond to the electorate. She came up with a very strong bill. It then got emasculated, but still part of it remained in a very strong provision. So what that does emphasize is that civil society, democratic processes do work, if imperfectly. The broader issue, though, is I think there is a structural issue in democracy, and particularly and that has to do with the role of campaign contributions. And there are reforms that could decrease the role that they play in our political system. For instance, one of the things that I advocate that we ought to do is to have free airtime during the campaigns on TV, because a lot of the money goes to buy television time and radio time. So if you reduce the need for money, you reduce the power of money. So that's an example of how we can try to change the rules. Whether we'll succeed in doing that is another question. But we know some of the levers that could affect the role that money plays in this system.
I guess it's not, from my own perspective, it's not really a real solution to climate change pricing externalities, because you're still going to have a world economy based on oil and gas. And I really think that innovation is the key, like you've spoken about, but it's governments which actually drive the research and development. And if you look at the American economy, if you look at China, if you look at European Union, they're only spending 2 to 3% on innovation, which historically is extremely low. If you just take America as an example, I think it's 10 times less than what it did when it was first created as a country. You've talked about incentives, but what really can be done to really stimulate innovation, to lead to a whole new revolution of the economy? Because that's what we're talking about with climate change, a revolution, not just a stopgap price mechanism, because that's not really going to do much.
Let me try to highlight two aspects of what you say, and I agree. The first is that I try to emphasize that the role of providing incentives for not just economizing, but also resources and the use of resources, but motivating innovation. But the second part of my talk, I mentioned the importance of the importance of innovation, and I criticized the intellectual property system. Most of the important innovations have come out of public support, have been based on government spending. The most important, I mentioned one, which is the Human Genome Project, which was publicly funded. What was the other most important innovation of the latter part of the 20th century? It was the internet. The basic research for internet was all government funded. It was then applied by thousands and thousands of companies around the world. So we have a system where we have the basic research typically done by government or financed by government. The patent system is an inefficient way of doing it. There are other ways of doing it, prize systems, that can also motivate innovation. And that's why it's very important that government research be used to incentivize, as the basis. And so I very much agree with you. The other area that I think that I probably should have mentioned more is that I actually think that we also need, there's an important role for regulation. I mentioned financial sector regulation, but also regulation is setting, for instance, mileage standards for automobiles, the use of coal for new powered plants. Because the worry is that the price signal is often filtered through imperfect market mechanisms that may not result in behavior of the kind that we want. And therefore, at least in some of these instances where the consequences of not doing the right thing are very serious, it does make sense to say we cannot allow more coal-fired furnaces without carbon storage. You can have carbon storage, but that's a cost you have to bear. So there is a role, I think, for regulation. It's a broader issue, but the basic point is the one you raise. Yeah.
How is constant growth for everybody actually sustainable? And yeah, how do you equal that equation?
Yeah. Well, we live in a finite world and with finite amount of resources, and if you grow exponentially, 1% even, population, eventually the Earth becomes too small in enough time. So there is some notion that there are limits to growth. But those may be very far out in the future. The immediate term, the issue is that we can't economize on the limited resources, and so we can actually use less resources and grow at the same time. But that will require innovation and greater efficiency in the use of our resources. And as I say, the good news is that we've been so profligate in our use of resources that it's not that hard to become more efficient in the use initially. But over the long run, we will have to innovate. And the problem is that we've had no incentives really to have innovation in the economizing of resources. And hopefully going forward, we will get more incentives in that direction. And I feel, some degree of confidence, we can't be sure, but with some degree of confidence, just like we've been so successful in economizing labor, we should be, there are good reasons to believe that we can be successful in economizing resources.
Just a quick question. I'm often sort of astounded by the way that we seem to have food surpluses in so many countries and massive food shortages in other countries. And I'm from an arts background, so it's all quite befuddling to me. Can you explain through an economic lens why we have this situation and how maybe, or will a carbon tax ameliorate that at all?
Well, actually, the problem, there's even a bigger puzzle than the one that you mentioned. People have done a study, Mark Chassain did some studies of a number of famines. These are extreme situations where people are dying for lack of food. And yet, in most of the situations where there are famines, if you look around, there is actually enough food. The Bengal famine of 1943, the potato famine in Ireland in the 19th century. Ireland was actually exporting potatoes when people were starving. Well, what is the answer? The answer is actually not that complicated. The people who were starving didn't have the economic resources, the money, to put it in a simple word, the income, to buy the food. So there's enough food in the world, but there are some people who don't have enough resources to buy the food. So you have the situation where Americans are obese, eating too much, complaining every day about going on a diet, and people in other parts of the world starving. And the reason is the distribution of access to economic resources. And that's why the question of who owns the resources, who gets access to resources, the distribution of income, is such a critical issue. Now, we have to try to understand why people don't have access to resources. How does the economic system result in some people having very high incomes and other people not having even enough income to buy the amount of food that would allow them to survive? And that is a very difficult question. What I tried to suggest before is that the theory that most economists accepted before was that pay, compensation, income was related to their productivity. But really the crisis has shown that that is probably not at least not a fully adequate explanation. There were people who had made a negative contribution to our society that were doing very well. So that, you know, and he was explaining, how do we explain the fact that the banks are making $1,000 per capita in Australia? Well, we actually understand some aspects of this, problems of imperfections of competition, monopoly power. In many parts of the world, corruption plays an important role. People get access to bribe politicians and get access to natural resources. And we've been talking about political processes in the United States. You don't bribe politicians, you make campaign contributions. That's corruption American style. And it actually generates even more inequality. So it's a more effective system for generating inequality. So, but this is an area where we really don't fully understand all the forces, but we do have a sense of some of the forces. The traditional theory has some degree of truth in it, that some compensation is related to differences in productivity and contributions. But again, one of the important areas in economics is to push back every question you have to answer, ask another question. In the United States, there are people who still get only a 6th, 7th, 8th grade education, whose economic prospects are not very good. Question is, why is that? And that turns out often to be related to political processes as well as economic and socioeconomic mobility and a whole variety of other factors.
Okay, we've got time for one more question up the back.
Professor Stiglitz, I think Bruce mentioned that this is the last of your engagements after, I think it's 18 days in Australia, where you've been all the way around the country and given lots of talks all over. Many of us feel that we've learned a great deal from your trip here and the talks and speeches that you've been very generous with in your time down here. But I wonder whether or not you also felt that you'd learned something from being here in Australia as well, in the sense of either reinforcing views that you already had, now that you've seen how we do things and what's going on here, or perhaps modifying somewhat the views that you had prior to coming here and staying for such an extensive time here in Australia.
Well, actually, both of those are true. I've been, I might say, bemused by some aspects of your political campaign. Quite frankly, you know, and this is, again, something people outside, people in Australia probably don't really see some things the way people outside. Outside, you know, in the G20 and the rest of the world, your stimulus package is almost universally viewed as the best in the world. Best design, you know, every aspect. Not that it's perfect, but, you know, we all admire you. And to see the criticism here is a little bit weird. A second thing is, the United States is facing, depending on how you measure it, a debt GDP ratio of, somewhere 70, 80%, going towards 100%. Some measure already 100%. You have a debt GDP ratio of around 5%. Our deficit, 1 year, last year, 10% of GDP. We don't understand how you're worrying about this. We wish we had your problem. It is, again, a total mystery of how you could have such absorption of a non-problem. If that is your worst problem, congratulations. But from what I've seen, there are some other problems that you ought to be focusing your attention on. The discussion of global warming, the discussion of the mining tax, has to me a lot of reinforces that is so similar in many ways to the debate in the United States, with the same kinds of political forces, the economics being pretty clear, and yet the political battle being the only thing is that in the United States, the mining issue was really located was only the senators who were directly bought by the mining companies that were on the other side. There were a lot of them. Here it seems to have gotten a lot more broader support. Again, a little bit of a mystery to me, but that probably has to do with how the politics was managed. So that's been on one side. The other interesting set of discussions I had, I think, are your banking system was actually much better regulated, and at least some of the discussions I had at the Reserve Bank of Australia showed at least just a much higher sensitivity to good economics than we have in the United States. So that I was very impressed, that the set of ideas, the set of models, the set of the approach, the regulation, and your banks. I mean, you've been criticizing, talking about the lack of competition, and still they managed their way through this crisis, perhaps because you had a crisis earlier and they learned their lessons, but still one of the things about your banks that I found at least so interesting is that your banks have stuck to banking. Now, you might find that, you say, what else do banks do? Well, most of the major banks in the United States are not making any money out of providing credit. That's no longer a major interest to them. It's speculation, trading, derivatives. The banks made $20 billion. A few banks made $20 billion last year out of the derivatives, the kind of things that exploded with AIG. So seeing banks that actually do banking is an interesting phenomenon. It is a rare species in the world. So you should enjoy this while it lasts and try to do what you can. And the final thing I mentioned, I alluded to very briefly, is corporate governance, while it's not perfect here, is an order of magnitude better than in the United States. And I think that's actually been a very important source for stability, social cohesion in Australia. And I wish I could figure out how to import that and that kind of discourse, the kind of way of looking at responsibility, corporate social responsibility, that I really saw really very, very widespread in the country. And that's a mystery, but I hope explain things here, and I hope I can figure out some way of importing it back to the United States.
Okay, so we're nearly finished. Bruce Chapman's going to say a few last words, but let me thank Professor Stiglitz for doing what he does so well, which is making economics so accessible and so simple. So I'll just ask you one last very simple question, and hopefully you have a simple answer. If Australia introduced a carbon tax and reduced some other taxes, would that be good or bad?
Good.
Thank you.